And we're live here in the Storycraft Cafe. I'm your host, Hank Garner, and today I am super excited to have Don Winslow on the show with me. He's got a brand new book that just released yesterday. It's called City of Dreams. It is the follow up to last year's City on Fire, one of my favorite books of the year last year, and the the story continues. I'm super excited about this book and so glad that it's finally released to the world as of yesterday when you're hearing this, if you're watching the live. And what an awesome book. Thanks for joining me again, Don.
Hank, thanks for having me again.
Absolutely. Don, if folks didn't pick up the book last year and they're just kind of coming into the
Yeah,
series, um what would you kind of give them the elevator pitch of what this series is about? And we'll
sure.
talk specifically about this new book here in a minute, but what's the world that people are getting into?
Yeah, basically they're getting into the world of a guy named Danny Ryan and a bunch of other people, but let's start with Danny. Danny is starts life in the first book as a longshoreman with sort of one foot in the Irish mob, and ends up fighting with the Irish mob against the Italian mafia in New England. Loses that war. And as a result, as we come into book two, is forced to flee Rhode Island and with his aging father and his infant son, and make his way across country to the West Coast.
And with the change of setting for this book, or the addition of setting, let's put it that way.
Mhm.
um there's a slight tonal shift to the book. The East Coast setting and the West Coast setting feel very different in the book.
Oh, good.
Was
Yeah.
was that something that you set out? Was that intentional?
Certainly something I aspired to. Yeah.
Sure.
I mean, traditionally in particularly in American culture, our sort of legends about reinventing ourselves generally involve Western migration.
Right.
you know, Historically, and California particularly is famous for a place that you go to recreate yourself. And then that sort of, quadruples when you consider Hollywood, the
Right.
dream factory, which is really where we invent our images of ourselves. And so, the first book being set almost exclusively in Rhode Island, has and needed to have that sort of New England gray, colder kind of feeling about it. And then when you get out to sunny California, and Danny's discovering it, as a guy who's never been there, then there needed to be a tonal shift to
Yeah.
adjust to that, something brighter, something maybe a little faster.
There's something interesting about life in the Northeast specifically, where you get actual winters, and
Yeah,
as opposed to down south where I live,
right.
or out west, as you
Yeah,
referenced earlier. There's the weather um, affects life in general, as you would expect, but the kind of there's a difference in attitudes almost. It's almost an immediacy about the Northeast, and maybe it's because of the cold,
mhm.
there's just it just feels like more. I'm grasping for words and I can't find the word that I want, but it just feels like there's more of a hurry. There's more of an immediacy is the only thing I can come up with.
Yeah, well, it's cold out and you want to get inside.
Right.
I
As
mean,
opposed to out west where things
yeah,
are a little slower, kind of
no,
more
yeah, yeah,
laconic and
yeah. I was just, I'm in San Diego at the moment. Prior to our interview, I was just out on the little balcony here at the hotel in the sunshine. Uh, in New England, you don't do that a lot,
right,
you know.
right.
And I think we used to joke that about a land so rocky that it costs you $50 to bury your cat. That you're coming from an area where people literally scratched a living out of the soil. And then you had, and in the case of Danny Ryan's family, an Irish background that was somewhat similar, of digging potatoes until the potatoes ran out. Um, and it's also, I mean, I think you're right. I mean, I think, in an environment where it can be gray for months, it definitely affects your mood, you
Right.
know? Yeah.
So as a writer, when you have these feelings that you want to convey to the reader, what sorts of imagery do you grasp for to let the reader feel the difference between East Coast and West Coast, for instance?
Yeah, I try to do it with as few brushstrokes as you will, if possible. As possible, rather.
Yeah.
I think you can try to write sort of lyrically about it. That's not typically my style. I would rather give you the color, the bottle green ocean in the North Atlantic versus the blue Pacific. I
Right.
think that says something. I think I use a sentence in maybe the first book, Providence, Rhode Island, is a gray city, you know, and so I don't want to burden the reader with a lot of description or a lot of adjectives. I want to maybe try to just put them on the scene, give them maybe two or three what I hope are vivid images, and hope that gets the work done.
Well, one thing that you have done is you have colored this setting, this landscape with people.
Mhm.
There's a lot of characters in these books, and a lot of um, the feeling of the city of the place comes through in the characters.
Y-
It what are your thoughts about creating characters that then
Well,
convey that feeling of
I,
setting?
I think characters and setting are almost indistinguishable. I don't know that you can have one without the other because we all come from somewhere, and those environments impact so heavily who we are. You know, there are a lot of people in these books. These books are a modern retelling of the Iliad and the Aeneid and the Odyssey, which are heavily populated,
Right.
with both human beings and gods. Yeah, so again, I mean, I think when you place an individual character in a specific place and have him or her react to it, you get this kind of double effect. Where hopefully what you're saying about the character helps inform the locale, and what you say about the locale informs the character.
Yeah. I think the last time we talked, Don, you mentioned this retelling of the Odyssey of the Iliad. Um, and I was thinking about that earlier. It in your mind, when you take on a project like this, do you start thinking of ways to connect a new story to this older archetypal story? Do you
Mhm.
start looking for direct ways to connect it?
Yeah,
Or
yeah.
what, like when you take on a retelling of something, what does that mean to you?
Well, in this case, it meant that it took me 28 years to write the trilogy, because it took a while, um, years, to come up with all those ideas. Some of them were quite easy, others were much more difficult. There's a character, Danny's mother, Madeline, who, if you go back to the classics, is the goddess Aphrodite. Who would that be in Providence, Rhode Island in 1988? That took a while to come up with. What would a Trojan horse be? You obviously can't bring a big wooden horse,
Right.
into the neighborhood and have troops spill out of it. And so, pardon me, I have a bit of an allergy
Sure.
as well. Sorry. Um, so that took years to do, but also that was the fun of it, you know, was to try ideas that didn't work, and I have hundreds of pages of those, where the delete key got hit, where my ideas didn't work, to come up with the ideas that did. Let me give you an example, from this book, from the present book. In the Aeneid, Aeneas is shipwrecked on the shores of Carthage, and he washes up on the beach, and he walks into a cave, and he sees murals, and he's shocked that they are murals of his past, of the Trojan Wars. Sees himself, his friends, what would the modern equivalent of that be? And I came up with movies. Danny gets to Hollywood and he's on the set of the movie that is about partially about him. He meets the actor that plays himself. That was a real kind of fun, kind of modern equivalent to do.
When you talk about writing a passage, or a portion of the book and it not working, and then backing up and finding a new way to tell that, um, I think that that sort of thinking intimidates a lot of people, who maybe think of writing as more structured, and that in the beginning they need to really plan out
Mm.
exactly how the story's going to
Yeah,
go.
yeah.
How do you think about, the working and reworking, the toiling, if you will, over a passage or a storyline until it gets right?
Well, it's what we do. That's our job. Listen, I mean, I think there are two major schools of thoughts about this, and neither is right or wrong. It just suits the individual. A lot of
Sure.
people are very heavy outliners, you know, and plan everything out before they commence to write, and that's one really good way of doing it. It's not my way. I don't like doing that because I want to be open to the possibility of surprises. Sometimes my characters will do and say things I never intended, certainly on a conscious level,
Yeah.
and that might take the story into a whole different direction, which is usually better than the one that I had planned or thought about. Having said that, with this trilogy, I had a rough roadmap because I'm following the Aeneid and the Odyssey
Sure.
and the Iliad and the Greek tragic drama. So I knew in a rough sense, what Aeneas, Danny, needed to
Yeah.
do. Again, the real problem and the challenge and the fun was in finding the modern equivalents to those, and the ones that worked. And I wrote some that really hideously did not work.
Do you save any of those things that didn't work?
No,
No.
no, no, no. You got, I mean, listen, there are all sorts of legends out of history of explorers setting out and you know landing on a beach and then burning the boat, so there's no possibility of them going back.
I
And I
love that
think,
analogy.
in my sense, I had to burn those boats.
Um, you said that this trilogy has taken you 20 some odd years,
Hmm.
to accomplish. These were obviously not the only thing that you've been working on for 20
Right, right,
some
right.
odd
Yeah.
years, because you have a very accomplished, back catalog
Well, thank
of
you.
other books that you have published.
Hmm.
Um, when you have a story like this that is kind of this big project hanging out there, how do you juggle the current project that you are publishing, with this kind of, passion project, if you want to look at it that
Yeah,
way?
no, I think that's a perfect way of putting it. Listen, I had to set this down, and focus almost exclusively on those other things. I wrote three rather large books about drug trafficking,
Right.
which were totally absorbing. But every once in a while, sort of late afternoon, I might, go and bring up, Danny and see where I was at with it, if I had any other ideas. Sometimes that was a discouraging process. Sometimes I looked at it and I thought, no, this is a mess and it's not going to work at all. And I don't have the talent to pull this off, So that was kind of it. And then later in my career, and I'd finished that drug trilogy. I did a book called The Force, and I did a book of novellas that I'd been wanting to do. And then I thought, okay, I think now's the time to just really pick this up and see if I can make it work.
In the, subsequent quarter century, if we're, putting it
Wow.
in
I was
round
really
terms.
thinking about it. Thank you.
I
I'm
didn't
just
mean
going
to
to take a
drop that.
nap right now, and I'll be back with you in a minute.
Yeah, I
Yeah.
didn't mean to drop that on you like that. But the world has changed quite a bit. Technology has changed quite a bit.
Sure.
Did your, um, concept of the story change as the times changed?
No, actually not. I from the beginning, I had the time frame that I wanted this book set in for really tactical reasons. I
Yeah.
knew where we were going to end up, and so I wanted to end up in a certain time frame, in the late 1990s, to wit. So I wasn't, or the book wasn't affected by a lot of the technological changes
Right.
that we've
Because
seen since
that's
that time.
past
Because
now, and
yeah,
what's set is set. Yeah.
exactly, and so every once in a while, maybe you're tempted to say, "Okay, let me set it right now," but it would not have made sense in terms of American criminal history,
Right.
right? You want to anchor these things somewhat in reality, even though they're based on myths. Although the Trojan War was apparently a real thing.
Yeah.
Um, and so no, it really didn't affect me. And but then you had to remember, you had to go back and think, oh, this is 1991. What existed then and what didn't exist then,
Right.
right?
And a lot of times what did not exist is a powerful tool in the author's hands, because I know a lot of crime slash mystery slash
Yeah,
thriller writers that are more and more setting books in the recent past to erase a lot of the conveniences of
yeah,
technology that we have now, that that would make a lot of these mystery stories kind of unravel when you could just text someone on your phone, or use your
exactly,
GPS.
exactly. Yeah, I mean, how many plots would have survived the cell phone?
Exactly.
If you did Raymond Chandler, or some of the other, those folks, how many plots would survive the advent of very sophisticated DNA analysis? Now some of those things make for great plots and great stories, particularly, in the more procedural ends,
Yeah.
of this business, where you can track the person because they're stupid enough to bring their cell phone along on their crimes. I was my wife likes these true crime television shows. Sometimes I watch them with them, and I'm thinking, why the hell do you guys bring your cell phone along?
Right. Or now, I mean, I have a smartwatch, that
Right, I do too.
you
Yeah,
leave your cell phone at home and your watch is still,
right.
pinging cell towers. It's crazy.
Yeah, and so if you're gonna go kill somebody, maybe leave that stuff at home,
Right. Right. Find a giant Faraday suit or something to wear.
something. Yeah, I know. Yeah.
Oh, when you start thinking about a new book, Don, if we're talking about the City trilogy in,
Mhm.
specifically, but you can
Yeah.
think about this in more general terms if you want. Do you start thinking like in the very beginning where the story is born? Are you thinking kind of big story concepts? I would like to tell a story like the Iliad,
Mhm.
and then start kind of casting that out,
Um,
or does a character like Danny
mhm.
just kind of pop in your mind? You're like, oh, who is this guy, and what would he be about?
Yeah, kind of both. It,
Okay.
it depends on the book, but let's talk about this trilogy and Danny specifically. I wrote the first sentence of this trilogy 28 years ago, and it hasn't changed a bit in
Wow.
in 28 years, because I had that strong image of Danny, watching this woman come out of the water, not knowing, but sort of sensing subconsciously that it was going to change everything.
Mm,
That to me was a real intriguing idea. But then I knew it was going to be part of the Aeneid. I knew I had that roadmap, to roughly follow. And so I pretty early on in the process started to think about those big ideas, those big concepts. I always knew the book was going to be a trilogy, because both Aeneas's life and therefore Danny's life fell into three distinct phases.
right.
And I knew I wanted to do that as opposed to writing one sort of thicker, longer volume in three parts. And so, yeah, I always had it in mind, where is this guy headed? Where are all these characters headed? And where did they come from? That to me was a real interesting part. You pick up the Iliad, we forget it. It starts in the middle of things and it ends in the middle of things,
Right.
right? In media res. And so I um I was intrigued by who these people were before we meet them in the Trojan Wars. What were their backstories, to use a modern concept? which became very important in terms of writing modern characters. How did Cassandra get to be Cassandra?
Right.
Right? How did Madeline get to be Madeline? And then also, in the second and third books of this trilogy, what happened to him after the war? You know?
Right. How do you, in a very practical sense, how do you manage a story this size? Because it is, I've seen a lot of things online, a modern epic, and it truly is epic in scope.
Mhm.
Not just the literary, label of epic, but it's literally epic. It's a huge story with lots of characters and
Mhm.
lots of locations. Um, how do you manage all that? Do you have a story Bible that you're
No,
working from? Is it just all exist in your head?
it exists in my head. Listen, I spent literally years reading and rereading and rereading those classics. I took online college courses in them, you know, until those stories became second nature. And then you spend a lot of time thinking about your characters, your version of it, until those characters are second nature, until you feel that you know them so well. You know what I mean? That you
Right,
know what they're going to say and how they're going to react. And you know, and so I knew the beats of these stories. I just did. Now the structural practical challenge was arranging them. When do you cut away from Danny to go to Chris Palumbo, who's
right.
Odysseus, right? At what point do you want to bring a different plot line in, and bring some of the older characters back, introduce new characters. So that was more the issue, and that was more the tougher part of moving those pieces around, to see where they worked. But no, I just keep it in my head.
When you published the first book
Mhm.
last year, last summer, City on Fire,
Mhm.
when you published that book, did you have book three finished?
No, I don't think so, but I was pretty close,
Okay.
if
What what
memory serves, you
what
know?
gave you the confidence at that time to go ahead with publishing this series? Because if you put out book one, and you know that it's going to have the impact that it's going to have, readers are going to be demanding those follow-ups.
Yeah.
What gave you the confidence to that for this story that you've held on for 25 years or
Right.
better? What
Yeah, with a lot of
when
doubts.
did you realize that, okay, this is ready now, where it had not been in the past?
Yeah, yeah, around the time the first book came out, I think. I finished the first book and I thought, "Okay, I think I can do this," you know? Uh, the second book was extremely difficult, a as second books tend to be, by the way.
Right.
Uh, but I had those great stories that I could borrow from,
Yeah.
Dido and Aeneas and the Oresteia and all of those things. And so, but I was lost in the weeds on book 2 for years,
Mm,
for years. And then, but while I was doing that, I was thinking about book 3, like Aeneas goes on and finds Rome. What the hell is that going to be?
right.
My answer was eventually Las Vegas. In a certain era, which is why
Yeah.
the time thing of this was so critical. Confidence is a funny thing. It ebbs and flows.
Yeah.
I don't know that I'm that confident now. You
Well,
know,
well,
um,
having those other books that you published that were, the that were such successes, that had to do something for your confidence,
yeah,
that you
sure, that helps.
yeah.
You know, but I mean, listen, and I think any writer experiences this on any given morning. When you go in to do that, you might think this might be the day I hear the scraping of the bucket at the bottom of a dry well.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
And it's over. But hopefully, look, you get better at what you do,
Yeah.
with experience and over the years, and I think I could probably handle language better. and handle story better, and particularly in an epic like this, handle structure better. And so, at some point you take a leap of faith, based on some of that, and you jump.
I like to say that the blank page is the great equalizer. It
Mhm.
doesn't matter how many New York Times bestsellers you
That's
have.
right.
When you start a new book, everybody stares at the exact same blank page.
No, exactly that. And listen, it's not just starting the new book, it's starting chapter 14,
Right, exactly.
right? You might come to that point where again, man, this thing's kicked my butt for years and now I'm trying it again, and you come to those moments where you're staring into, I guess it's a black screen anymore as opposed to a page, but uh,
Right.
but listen
Hopefully,
again,
the metaphor still holds, but
it
yeah,
absolutely holds, but I've found the thing to do is just start typing
yeah,
because you can always fix it.
you're right.
It's not like you're not an emergency room doctor operating on a kid, right? We can make mistakes and do all the time, and
Right,
listen, I know that on days when it's not going well, I should keep writing badly because sometimes I have to write 10 or 12 bad pages before I write that one good sentence that then opens it up,
right, right.
breaks through,
And
you
and
know?
what's the old adage? It's a lot easier to edit a bad page than a blank page. At least you've got
Absolutely.
something to work from.
No, absolutely. I often quote the old saying, which is also apparently reminiscent of Michelangelo, but there's an old self-defense martial arts saying, how do you carve a tiger? And the answer is you take a big block of wood and you cut away everything that doesn't look like a tiger.
Right.
But that's great, sure, but first you have to have the big block of wood. And that
Exactly.
block of wood a lot of times is a lot of mistakes and a lot of bad writing.
Yeah. Book 2 of a trilogy is a unique, is a unique thing. Beginnings are one thing, endings are another, but that middle, is something entirely different
Yeah,
because, as a book, it needs to have its own structure and ebbs and flows like every book does. You need to
yeah,
have high points and low points, and you need
right.
to have a beginning and you need to have a resolution,
Yep,
but it doesn't need to be an ultimate resolution because we have a whole nother book that needs to be
right.
the series resolution.
Exactly, but it can't just be a bridge.
Right, right, exactly, because when it's just a
Right.
bridge, it just feels like filler and then,
Yeah, and you're cheating the reader,
exactly,
right? If you're saying to the
exactly.
reader, "Hey, book 1 and book 3 are, you're gonna love, but, in between there, we gotta go to book 2," you shouldn't write book 2. You should
R
just write book 1 and book 3 and
right.
tell them very quickly what might have happened if you had written book 2, right?
Mm, that
Um,
that is a great y yeah, yeah,
yeah,
yeah, that I
like, why
love
do
that.
it? There's
Right,
no reason for it, and there's no reason to inflict that on a reader. You owe them more than that. Um, when I said book 2 and this was hard, it was hard because of the subject matter, but there was plenty of subject matter and plenty of story, right?
right,
I knew that I would take Aeneas into this great love story, so I knew I had that, and that was worth writing. I also knew I was going to be following the Odysseus character around his journeys, and there was plenty of story there that was worth writing. And I knew I was going to start the story and do the first two plays of Orestes' cycle, where in this case Peter Moretti comes home. And I don't want to ruin the book by telling you what happens, but there's this whole, frankly, wonderfully noir plot that came out of Aeschylus's plays. So I knew that for book 2 I had plenty of story, and mind you, otherwise I would not have written this as a trilogy, right? I
you're
just said,
right,
yeah, just jump ahead to the next thing, you
yeah,
know. But I knew there was plenty of story here. When I said it was difficult, what I meant was it was difficult in terms of finding the right modern equivalents to those ancient stories. And I screwed it up a bunch of times, you know, writing frankly, stuff when I reread it was just stupid.
I, I've been there. I know
You
exactly
know,
what you
just
mean.
what were you thinking? You know,
Yeah.
I set this down for like a year or so, and then I came back to it and read it. You know, it's about 150 pages of book two, 100 of which I deleted.
Mm. When you have a moment like that, is it is it this feeling? Well, crap! I just lost 100 pages, or is it like, okay, I can now get rid of those
Yeah,
100 pages because now the lock has turned, and
exactly,
yeah,
exactly. It's almost a good moment, you know, because you
yeah,
go,
I know
"Oh
what you mean.
man, this idea that I spent, you know, months on was a bad idea." But I had to spend those months to know that it was a bad idea,
Right,
right? Now I have a much better idea, much clearer road ahead of me, something that writes well, it makes sense because what I had written really didn't make sense.
right,
It was implausible in a real world. And that's a very liberating kind of feeling.
sure,
Yeah, I don't mind doing the work, right? It's the work I love, right? So now I get to write a different 100 pages, and that's fine. That's good. Yeah.
right. If the difference between book 2 and book 1, is like almost going from, black and white to Technicolor in
Mhm.
a lot of
Yeah.
senses.
Yeah, I thought
Um,
so too, actually.
with a tonal shift like that from book 1 to halfway into book 2,
Mhm.
what does book 3 hold?
Another big tonal change,
Oh,
you know? Because
yeah,
again, I wanted 3 books. Otherwise, I would have written 1 book in 3 parts.
sure, sure.
Right? But I wanted 3 books with a gap between them because I think the reader needed that gap,
Yeah.
you know, needs that gap, and Danny needs that gap, and those tonal changes are needed. I think that you could pick up any of these 3 books and read them as an individual book.
Well, I'm glad you, mentioned that because I saw a review, maybe it's on the NetGalley site, not I think that's where it was, where a reader had picked up book 2,
Mhm,
and I think it was a he said, he was like, "This was such a great book. I felt like there were a couple of threads that I needed to be filled
mhm,
in on, and I wish I would have read book 1 first,
mhm.
but this was a great book." That like
Yeah,
he had a satisfying experience. I
good.
think he realized he could have had a more satisfying
Yeah.
experience, but it stood, and I think that's a great testament to
Well,
for
yeah.
the ability of a book inside a trilogy to just stand on its own.
Thank you, I appreciate that, you know, that it's hard to do, you know, you have to give in a second and a third book people enough of a backstory
Yeah.
that the threads hold, but not so much that you're just doing this data dump on them,
Right.
you know, which is
You want
really
it to feel like a
tedious.
rehashing at the beginning,
Yeah,
but
yeah,
yeah,
and again, that's why you write 3 books, but that's what we owe the reader, you
yeah,
know, is like 3 very separate experiences, but then they can put them together and go, "Oh, wow," you know? There's that. And I feel the same way about book 3. I think you could pick book 3 up, you know,
right.
and from page 1, go on this ride with Danny and these other characters, and then later on, if you wanna go back and see what happened before, great. But you don't need to.
Yeah.
Yeah.
After we talked last year, I went and got the audiobook of City on Fire and
Oh, yeah?
listened to the audio
Okay.
after having read it. But it
Wow.
had been maybe a month and a half since I had read it,
Okay.
and I experienced it all over again in audio. What a fantastic audiobook.
Oh, I'm
Um,
glad to hear
uh,
that, yeah.
oh, it was amazing. Have you heard any of the book
Yeah,
2 audio?
yeah, yeah. Good stuff, you know,
Oh,
good stuff.
awesome.
Yeah. Yeah, listen, I think that, I think 2 things about this, you know. One is interesting to me because sometimes people ask me, "Well, do you mind if I do the audiobook instead of read it?" I say, "Of course not, because we've been telling stories in various formats for millennia."
Of course.
And let's remember that the Iliad and the Odyssey were originally stories that were told,
Right.
not read,
Exactly.
told. You
Yeah.
know, and the other thing I think about it is we sometimes forget, that when people are reading a book, they hear the words in their minds,
Exactly.
that there's an auditory sensation to this that we need to pay attention to when we're writing.
Great point. Well, the new book is City of Dreams. It is available everywhere now that you purchase books. We're going to put links to it in the show notes where you can grab it from Amazon or Audible, or if you prefer, go visit your local bookstore and support local books as well. Don, always fun to catch up. I love the new book. I'm telling
Thank you very
everyone
much.
that they need to go grab it.
Thank you.
Tell folks where they can find you online if they want to read about all the stuff you got going on.
You can find me on my website, donwinslow.com. You can find me on Twitter, Don Winslow Twitter.
Excellent. We'll link those up as well.
Great.
Don,
Thanks so
always a
much.
pleasure to catch up. Thank you for
My
joining me
pleasure,
today.
man. I appreciate your time. Okay.